Thank you for Viv and the UCL team for asking me to speak here today. I really feel like I'm going to reference everyone who's spoken before today, and Vaughan's talk was a really important, reflective way of looking at arguments and really kind of looking at the balanced view of things. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to take us forward, and I'm going to suggest that there is no other way to work with mental health, broadly speaking, than a transdiagnostic approach. But you'll see how I qualify that in terms of how we understand classification and diagnosis. So I'm going to first cover why we should develop transdiagnostic psychological interventions, look at the evidence for the processes being transdiagnostic, look at the evidence for the interventions, and then I'm going to home in on a theoretical perspective that myself and colleagues want to push forward in terms of understanding psychology and neuropsychology from a transdiagnostic perspective called perceptual control theory. And I'm going to share with you a number of different modalities of interventions that we've pushed forward from this perspective. Okay, so I want to start a bit like Vaughan did with validating the use of diagnosis already in mental health interventions. So the classic example I'm going to illustrate in is disorder-specific CBT. A large number of successful, well-controlled trials have been conducted based on models with good evidence developed through a reciprocal connection between theory, research and practice, and that identify key mechanisms, key cognitive mechanisms that maintain distress. Okay, so this research is very well conducted, but people sometimes critique whether this applies in the real world. Well, I'm going to give you one example of where it clearly does apply in the real world. This is a trial that the group developing the CBT model of post-traumatic stress disorder applied first in a randomised controlled trial in Oxford, where they got a large effect size for delivering their intervention, and then the same group of trainers trained local clinicians in Omar after the bombing and got exactly the same, if not slightly higher, effect size in a non-randomised controlled trial. Okay? So this is an example where a diagnosis has been used, a model's been based on it, and a very successful intervention has been provided in the real world in an extremely responsive manner. So one might think, okay, let's just apply that across the board then. But have another think. How often do people cluster together like this as having the same disorder? In this example, people clustered together because they'd all been affected by the same specific trauma in the same geographic location. Does this apply to how we as services generally see people? We, in primary and in secondary care services, we may see hundreds of different types of disorders. Is it feasible, like you guys have been through, training hundreds of different models? Let's say you all know at least a dozen models of different psychological disorders. Is that an efficient way of you to be trained? Also, it raises a question of issues around protocols. In clinical practice, and this has been found through the IAP trials, the average number of sessions people attend is about 5, which is not the number that they're generally recommended in clinical guidelines. And when studies have looked at the amount of clinical change per session, it's actually the first session where people get the most change. So it's really important to get in there early. But often, in a standard model, you've barely socialised the person into the model or done an assessment in that first session. So what on earth is going on here? We're also well aware, again, through a lot of people talked about high levels of comorbidity. So how do you select which disorder to prioritise if you are diagnosis-based? But what I think is one of the most kind of not mentioned aspects is that in most clinical services, as we saw in psychiatry, standardised diagnosis is not actually conducted. When you do standardise it, you get much higher levels of reliability and validity. But it takes about an hour and a half or so to do a standard diagnostic interview. And none of you guys, as clinical psychologists, are trained to do it unless you have to do your research using it. And most psychiatrists don't even use it in practice. So at face value, how do we know we're actually working with the same clients in front of us that have gone through the research trials if we haven't used the same tools? And often people come up with all kinds of difficulties that don't necessarily map onto their so-called disorder. And again, I think this is consistent with what Ray said this morning and what Vaughan's been saying today. But I think this pushes us to look for a universal therapy that we can start early on with people. And that driver pushed four of us to review the literature at that point. So this is a while ago now that we looked at the studies of cognitive processes across different disorders where they'd all been diagnosed. And we used those studies as a way of testing whether the processes that maintain distress were not specific to different disorders, but were actually shared amongst them. And doing that, we found that at face value, about 12 different processes were shared across disorders and were present in every disorder that they'd been assessed in. Here's a taster or a summary of those ones that we identified. Now, this took us to a point many years ago where we were aware that these processes were transdiagnostic, okay? But we also looked at these processes that psychologists use to inform their treatment and realised it would be pretty complex to build a simple transdiagnostic therapy using 12 to 15 different processes. And we had a hunch, and since then I've pursued that hunch with colleagues, that there's something else going on underneath the surface of these processes. And what we need to do is look at how these processes are related to one another. Because at the moment there are transdiagnostic interventions, and the interesting thing is not only is there evidence that all the cognitive behavioural processes that maintain disorders are transdiagnostic, the interventions that have been developed so far have actually got good evidence to date. So there's a number of reviews and meta-analyses that have been conducted, generally all found the kinds of effects that are equivalent to disorder-specific CBT. And then the last one, the meta-analysis there in 2017, that covered 67 studies and compared across studies, pulled them together, looked at the effect sizes of disorder-specific versus transdiagnostic interventions. They found very close effect sizes, and if anything, the transdiagnostic interventions were statistically superior to the disorder-specific. Okay? So even without a coherent transdiagnostic model, we've got these kinds of interventions that are already showing that transdiagnostic interventions are effective. But I think those kind of assessments of effects miss out some really important questions. They miss out how necessary the diagnostic assessment is. Can we just drop them? They miss out the efficiency that can be gained, the theoretical integrity. They miss out studies of what might be the mediating mechanism in a transdiagnostic therapy. And they miss out really important issues as well about cost effectiveness, not just of delivery, but of training these interventions. And I would have a strong hunch that many of these questions will be in the favour of a transdiagnostic approach. But as I pointed to before, I want to home in on a more coherent, unified account of psychological distress. And Peter earlier talked about the P factor, of which, as you saw, there's pretty compelling evidence that there's one factor associated with this persistence of distress. I'm also going to point to the fact, again linked to what Warren was saying, that biology and diagnosis do not need to be equated with each other. There are biological theories that are transdiagnostic, and there are strong biological or neurobiological or neuropsychological models that cut across diagnoses as well. So this approach may blend those two aspects. Okay, so what kind of core process research have we been involved with? This is a study that Trishna Patel carried out at UEL with herself and David Veal, and she recruited a wide range of people with different psychiatric diagnoses, and she developed her own scale that had items that tapped into all those different processes that you saw that we covered in the literature. She did a factor analysis on it, and just like Peter's study earlier for symptoms, we found a single factor solution when you look at processes. That factor correlated with all the standardised measures, it differentiated the clinical versus the non-clinical sample, and it didn't differentiate between different diagnostic subgroups. Most recently, I worked with Peter McAvoy in Perth, where we looked at the data from patients that had gone through his clinic for anxiety and depression with various different anxiety disorders and depression. And they had completed many different measures of different kinds of processes, again like the ones we reviewed. And Again, we did a factor analysis, and again, we found a single factor solution. This time, though, we carried on extracting 5 more factors from this factor analysis. Then we looked at their correlations with symptoms. Only the first factor correlated with symptoms. Everything else we extracted after that did not actually associate with psychopathology. So there does seem to be something at the core across different mental health problems. Okay, and we're going to converge on this in a moment. But I'm going to encourage you to take a view of classification and diagnosis, which I hope is as illuminated as Vaughan's as well. Think about classification across the sciences. Classification is something that's pivotal to both biology, chemistry. We use it in the periodic table, we used it to classify animals and plants. The question of its reliability and validity may not be the same question as how efficient and how necessary it is for treatment. So imagine to yourself that you're starting up a sanctuary for sick birds in your local area, okay? Which of the 2 books I'm going to show you, if you could only buy 1 book, will you invest in to train your staff, okay? Will you buy everyone the Spotter's Guide to Birds? Or will you buy everyone the bird care book, everything you need to know to keep any bird healthy and happy? Okay. Put your hand up for the Spotter's Guide. Put your hand up for the bird care book. Okay, everybody. Right. If that book does what it says on the tin, that's obviously what you're going to get. Okay? But wait a minute, the Spotter's Guide to Bird is almost 100% valid and reliable. It's an extremely scientifically sound, well-informed book. Why are you not going to use it? Something can be extremely scientific, so even if something is very scientifically valid, it's not necessarily the right tool for the job, and that's Vaughan's point as well. So, could there be something analogous to the bird care book for psychology? Okay. We've talked about birds and animals. I'm going to, again, get you to zoom back, think about science as a whole, think about classification system as a whole. And I'm going to get yourself to imagine you're Charles Darwin, round about the turn of the 19th century. You've got access to the classification system of animals and birds and plants, and you want to derive a theory, but you're a bit cocky, you're ambitious. You're going to develop a theory of change in all life forms. You're not going to develop a theory of whelks or barnacles or whatever. You're going to develop an entire theory of evolution. Now, I think Darwin took a very interesting, critical approach to this classification system of his time. He didn't undermine it, he just looked at all the seams and the connections between the categories. He found that different species share features. He found that there are continuities in features between species. He found that there was huge individual variation within a species. He found that these criteria that naturalists had used as a kind of a tick-off criteria actually had a function for those animals in terms of their survival. He showed, importantly, that features and species change over generations by looking at the fossil record. And he developed a unified theory that generations of biologists have used since to model change, unified what he observed in animals and plants. And I will put to you, and you've seen it today, exactly the same parallels are there in the classification system of psychiatry. Different mental disorders share symptoms. Symptoms vary in degree and intensity across disorders. There's huge variation within a diagnosis. Diagnosis changed over time. We heard laser count this morning. And I think we should be cocky enough to look for a theory that tries to explain change across all diagnosis. That's not just to play down the fact there'll be different presentations of problems where that applies differently. But I think there should be a parallel theory in psychology that is one of psychological functioning in general and not specific to a particular subcategory. Where are we going to look for this? One way we can look for this is we can just listen to people and ask them about how they had their mental health difficulties and how they recovered from them. And we've done this in a whole array of different groups of people. And one thing we notice is people tell us that they reach this sort of rock bottom level in their lives where they lose control. Now, these may be people with anorexia where everyone else is telling them and controlling their treatment. Maybe people with depression who can't get out of bed in the morning. Maybe people in a height of a panic attack that can't control their own emotions. But essentially, we see these themes of control and loss of control in distress and psychological difficulties. And you see this evidence coming in the wider literature too. So I think if this is the case, we need a theory about control, and we need a theory that's a robust theory, a bit like evolution, one that you can actually sort of describe and model and test in a very tight way. And the theory that myself and Viv and colleagues have discovered and used like this is called perceptual control theory. Now, perceptual control theory is actually based on an area called control engineering. Okay, so it comes from a very different area in psychology. It's based on the idea of negative feedback. Now, negative feedback on an industrial scale is what keeps everything controlled and running smoothly. So this device here is called a Watts governor. Now, when a steam furnace is burning for a steam engine, the steam comes through the valve and starts moving the parts. Okay? As it moves the parts, these balls rotate faster. As they rotate faster, they rise, and that closes the inlet to the valve into the steam engine. That ensures that the mechanism goes at a fixed rate. Okay? And you can adjust that rate by changing the size of the balls on the system. And this is what's called negative feedback. It's the same system functionally as you use in your body to keep your body temperature constant. You act against the disturbances to keep an input, in this example, the speed of the engine in a fixed way. Without this device, there wouldn't have been an industrial revolution, most likely. I would put it to you that right now, you guys are controlling all kinds of things, and not just in your body, which is vital. You're controlling your temperature, your hormone concentrations, all kinds of chemicals in your bloodstream. You're also controlling using your behaviour. If you weren't doing that, you'd all be slumped down on the floor. Just to keep your heads upright, you've got groups of muscles that are twitching in opposite directions to keep your head still. Your eyes are tracking. Your mind's, your thoughts, you're controlling your mental thoughts at times as well. If you didn't control, you wouldn't be here today. Control is an essential part of what we do. And the amazing thing about control is you don't know you're doing it. You're doing it all the time, and it was only when I put your attention to it, you said, oh, yeah, maybe I'm keeping my head up here. Okay. Think how terrifying it would be if all those things that you're controlling in your life, your routine, your conversation, your speech, think of what would happen if you suddenly lost control over those things overnight and you had to regain them again. I would put it to you that this is why people with mental health difficulties are so focused on control, because they've lost control of things most of us take for granted. So how does control work? What I'd like to do now is show you a very short video clip. And there are two people in this video clip. On the right is the experimenter, on the left is a volunteer. The volunteer on the left with a green pen has been given an instruction about something to do, okay? And they are following that instruction to the letter, okay? What I'd like you to do is think about what is that person on the left doing? What have they been told to do? Okay? Okay. Anybody like to hazard a guess at what that person on the left was instructed to do? Yeah? Copy the person on the right, okay. Put your hand up if you thought it was to copy or do the mirror image of the person on the right. Okay, quite a few there. Unfortunately, that's not right. Okay. Anything else?
Keep the knot in the middle over the dot.
Keep knot in the middle over the dot. Put your hand up if you thought that. 2 people. 3 people, including you. Anyone else? A couple of people who've seen it before. That is the right answer. Okay. What is going on there? Is that the person on the left is trying to keep the knot in the middle of that rubber band over the dot on the page, okay? They look like they're doing the opposite from the person on the right. because that's the means that they can keep the knot over the dot. And they have to indirectly draw this picture just to keep the knot over the dot. Okay? We've done research on this where about 95% of people get this wrong. And I think that's pretty profound, given that you're all psychologists, you're all observing the behaviour, and generally you don't see people's intentions. And this relates right back to Ray's point about the not knowing. We don't necessarily know what people are trying to do when we view their behaviour. So who are we to classify that and describe it or impose our psychological terminology on it? But there's also a much more important point about that, which is how we build theory and how we understand what control is. This is Bill Powers, who proposed essentially a psychological form of homeostasis, that our brain is, just like the body is controlling physiological variables to keep us alive, the brain, via our behaviour through the environment, is controlling sensory inputs to keep us alive and happy as well. This theory is related to cybernetics, but it's got important differences, and you could sum it up as the idea of behaviour as a control of perception. I'm not going to go through this model in detail, but one important thing to remember about this model is it's continuous and dynamic. There is no simple step between stimulus, a cognitive process, and a response. This system is cycling all the time to control its input, to control its stimulation, if you like. And the argument is that this is what most of us are doing most of the time. We are not reacting to stimuli in any kind of predictable manner. Our behaviours are changing dynamically to keep things like knots over dots, to keep our self-esteem in the way we want it to be, to keep our anxiety levels in the way we want those to be. And that's how we are built up. That's our architecture. It's a whole set of just rights or goal states that are organised in relation to one another. And the observable behaviour is just what we do to keep that right, to keep that homeostatic balance, if you like. The theory as a whole includes this concept of control. It also includes the concept of hierarchies. This is the idea that given all the things we're trying to control in our lives, we need to organise them in some way. And the most adaptive way to do that is to control the important long-term things in our lives, like our values, our principles, our self-ideals, by setting ourselves goals for the more concrete things in life. Our rules, going down to our routines, going down to our everyday perceptions. And a simple way to navigate your way through your own hierarchy is to ask yourself a why question to go up and a how question to go down. This is related to what we do in therapy, but not quite it. Conflict is the third principle I want to introduce you to, and I was surprised that Peter didn't mention that earlier, given it's a sort of foundation of a psychodynamic and an attachment approach. From a PCT perspective, there are many reasons why people can lose control over things, and brain injury is one of them, but maybe the most pernicious way that we can lose control is through conflict. This is where we are striving to experience two opposing things, but where we're not willing or able to put our attention to it to resolve that conflict. So a classic example of a client I work with, she went through a lot of her life with moderate, if you like, symptoms of trauma, but when it came to going into court, where she needed to describe her trauma to the police and then to the court, she experienced an extreme escalation of her problems. And this, I would put to you, is because she didn't just have the goal of trying to suppress those memories, she also had the goal of trying to remember them in as much detail as possible. So she was in conflict about how much detail she'd remember those memories. And the idea is that any one of us can be in conflict over things, and we manage that conflict by bringing it into our awareness, thinking about it, talking about it, and naturally we will find a solution to that. And there's a process called reorganization in the theory, which is an intrinsic trial and error thing that our brain does to solve those problems. And most of us do that for most of our problems most of the time. The proposal is that the reason why people have persistent loss of control over their lives is they're either unwilling or unable, or their life situation is such that they cannot bring that information into awareness. They can't talk about it, they can't think about it, they can't experience the emotions that come into mind when they actually start to put their awareness on what's driving their problems. Okay? And therapy is just a process of helping shift awareness to that in a way that's, from the client's perspective, under their own control. And that's a difficult balancing act. Okay, I've given you a clinical example. You can maybe read that in your own time. I'm going to move on to the kinds of interventions that we've pushed forward. And for now, we're going to call this Get Control, a whole life approach to the science of wellbeing and mental health. And we really want to think about how we can change things from people's everyday experiences and not restrict this purely to the clinical psychology domain or the therapist domain. So one really important aspect that Tim Carey's been working on is showing how if you allow patients to control their own access to therapy, make their own appointments, decide how many appointments they need, you don't get overwhelmed by need. You actually get people acting in responsible ways and accessing therapy when they need it. And when this has been studied, it actually reduces waiting lists by giving people control over their own appointments rather than sending out those appointment letters, people don't make it, DNA, discharge, etc., etc. If you do that in your service, show them this evidence and let's stop that happening. The other thing that we focused on is the importance of client control during therapy. And this is often a subtle aspect that's not been fully studied. But we would encourage you in your existing therapies to build up the client-led aspects of it. To do things like talk about the pros and cons of any kind of safety-seeking behaviour rather than to assume that you need to reduce a certain action. And really to allow clients to have their own take exposure and behaviour experiments at their own pace. And we have some evidence from an experimental study which, as far as we can read, is the first study that's truly matched exposure in two conditions and changed the amount of control that participants have over their exposure in a simple spider phobia exposure task. So in this study, people were allocated in pairs where one had control over their distance to a spider image and some neutral images, and the other pair got exactly the image distances that the first person had got. So they were yoked in terms of exposure. But one person had almost complete control and the other one had very little control. What we found is that the people that had control over their own exposure approached a spider closer after the exposure task and 2 weeks later had less avoidance, even though, as I say, this task ensured that they were matched in terms of level of exposure. We've also used this task to really get to the bottom of this idea of behaviour and the fact that we're all stuck on this idea that we somehow learn behaviour in this almost robotic manner. And we've repeated this study 3 times where we've manipulated it so that a different action, different behaviour that you have to do as a participant allows you to control your perceived distance from the image on the screen. And what we find is that consistently people with spider phobia keep the image further away from themselves. Okay? They do this even if you switch the direction that they have to move the joystick from trial to trial, and even if they have to relearn it every single trial. So people with difficulties have not got learnt behaviours. They've got learnt preferences for how they'd like to perceive the world, how close they'd like to perceive certain things. We are built up from these perceptual preferences. We do not learn behaviours. Our behaviours are what we do in the moment to keep our experience as we want it to be. And we've looked at this in a fine-grained way where we did a therapy, which is method of levels, which I'll talk about in a minute. We did a case series where patients had a 20-minute session that was videotaped, and then they looked back at the video of their own therapy, and every 2 minutes they rated some aspects of the therapy. And we were interested in what predicted helpfulness every 2 minutes of the therapy session. And what we found was there was this very tight relationship between how in control the person felt in their therapy session and how helpful they found the therapy at that moment. There's some graph to show some of the very tight relationships and some of the less tight relationships. But basically, when you put this into aggression, you find that control, talking freely, so just having the opportunity to say what you want to say in this sort of unedited way, relates to helpfulness. And only one aspect of the therapeutic relationship came up in this study. So we think this really puts the emphasis on the mechanism of what makes a therapeutic interaction helpful. And we think it's very similar to what Ray was saying this morning about this not knowing, this curiosity, this ability to help the person tell you what's going on and to help them be in control of how they use the session. And that's what Method of Levels is about. It's a transdiagnostic cognitive therapy based upon this theory. In Method of Levels, everything that the therapist said is a curious question, and it's an open question. And the therapist, to make this very simple and easily to train and tightly adherent, only has two things to think about. And we're not telling them what their behaviours are, we're just giving them goals. The goals are to help the client talk about the problem, and secondly, to ask about what we call present moment disruptions. So the idea is that by helping the person talk about the problem, you're helping them lead the session, but there will be aspects of them trying to understand their problem that are at the fringes of their awareness, that they may have left behind or not mentioned if you don't draw attention to it. So this is a method of guided discovery that helps people notice some of those things on the inside to help elaborate their own understanding of the problem. And again, just like Ray was saying, this is a process of helping a person understand for themselves. The therapist doesn't actually need to understand what the person is telling them. But from the outside, they're providing the scaffolding for the person themselves to develop that understanding. There's other reasons why you notice disruptions to do with the model. It might notice conflict, it might notice control as it's happening, and it might help people shift and notice those high-level goals and values that they may have missed if you hadn't drawn their attention to it. And the interesting thing about this therapy is we just keep on doing that. We don't have an end point. We just say to the client, you keep coming as long as you think this is helping you, and you tell me when you no longer need it. There are a number of studies published for this. Most of these are open case series studies in very pragmatic settings where patients are not being selected on the basis of their diagnosis and therefore very heterogeneous. Now you do, because of the patient opt-in and opt-out, you get a fair bit of attrition in these studies, but generally you find some good effect sizes for some of the main outcomes in those services. And this has been delivered in several primary care services and in secondary care services. This is a randomised controlled trial, a very small one, that we ran as a proof of concept, where we gave Method Levels within a 3-month window and compared that to the other interventions that the client was getting, which was typically some sessions of their CBT. And we show that at least over that window, you get this faster change in Method Levels. Now, obviously, this isn't a fair comparison for the whole therapies as a whole, but it just tells you something about the opportunity within a 3-month window. Now, Method Levels, we think, is a very elegant approach that has a solution to help clients help themselves on their own terms in ways that are barely considered by other approaches in certain contexts. In prisons, with the work, and inpatient wards, at the work that Viv's done. We've had a therapist that's gone to death row and worked with clients. We've just finished recruiting for an NHR fellowship in early intervention psychosis, and we're testing it out in schools. These are contexts where the opportunity to work with someone on this more ad hoc basis that's driven by their own needs, it really comes into its own. Okay, what else have we done across interventions based on this theory? We have a course called the Take Control course. Now, this recognises the fact that maybe one-to-one therapy isn't always the most efficient way to deliver change. And so we provide a very interactive experiential course that helps people to really understand these principles of control, conflict and reorganisation in a very accessible way. And we've shown in an intention to treat analysis that this is non-inferior to a one-on-one intervention within a low-intensity IAPT service. And we're widening this Take Control course to schools, for example, at the moment. We also have an online intervention, a piece of artificial intelligence which helps people talk about their problems and asks questions. And we've done 2 randomised controlled trials in student samples that have shown that this is feasible and acceptable and getting some encouraging effects in terms of helpfulness. And we're, again, trying to push that forward in a more of a clinical domain. There's also been other people allied to our work who have pushed this theoretical underpinning forward. So, for example, Phil McAvoy in the social enterprise we work closely with in Salford has developed a whole way of having what he calls empowered conversation with people with dementia. This isn't a therapy, this is a way of understanding how to talk to someone to empower and give them as much control as possible of the conversation despite their cognitive difficulties. So, in summary, I think that taking the transdiagnostic approach as a whole, there are important economic, ethical and scientific reasons for delivering transdiagnostic interventions. And I've put to you a scientific rationale for deriving interventions from perceptual control theory. And I think we need a scientific basis, not just a humanitarian basis, to deliver this, because we need to be on equal footing with people that are going to offer other kinds of interventions. PCT provides the scientific explanation for why client-led care and patient-centred work is not only beneficial to that person, it's just the way people function, it's the way living things function. And in doing that, we end up with an intervention that you can apply to domains that maybe traditional psychological interventions have rarely touched. The problem and the challenge with this, like we said earlier about transdiagnostic approach generally, is it challenges assumptions that people have about psychopathology and services. But we think there's so many other benefits. We've heard work recently from Israel about immediate reactions to trauma that are ways of training people to regain control and counter their sense of helplessness in the immediate aftermath of the trauma. And we can see the theoretical links between that and what we're doing. We can see the use in a moment of crisis where control, again, and conflict are heightened. We can see the use in areas like anti-radicalisation where you can use entirely the client's own language and don't impose your own agenda on how the person's talking to you and moving forward in their lives. So I think I'm going to try and make 2 cases. First, that why do it any other way than the transdiagnostic approach? And really, why do it any other way than putting control and our theoretical understanding of control at the heart of interventions? And I really mean that. Why do it any other way? Why, really? Why? Thank you.